Welcome to Rehab Remix, Reimagining Boundaries, the podcast that explores the future of orthopedic rehab within the construct of clinical innovation and connected health. I'm Rohit Nayak, co-founder of Band Connect, your host for the segment. In each segment, we will feature discussions with practitioners and clinicians, but we will also bring in other stakeholders such as administrators, industry leaders, researchers, each of whom are playing a role in helping advance a healthier future. Our goals through these discussions is to energize all of you to play a role in helping us address the many challenges we all face in physical therapy and orthopedic rehab as patients, clinicians, or clinical leaders. Today, it is my privilege to introduce Larry Benz. As a brief introduction, Larry, as many of you know, is a luminary in the PT industry. As a trained practitioner and a doctor of physical therapy, successful entrepreneur and a business operator in the PT clinic segment, and more recently in the dental care segment through his private equity affiliations. He is better known as the founder and chairman of Confluent Health, an industry leader in musculoskeletal health operating over 800 clinics across the country under various brands. What is probably less known is that Larry also served as a U.S. Army captain in the Army Medical Specialist Corps, during which he earned the Meritorious Service Medal. Congratulations, Larry. More recently, Larry has earned a large following with his substack segment called All Things Physical Therapy. If you like pithy, meaningful, and practical discussions on all things physical therapy, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, you'll enjoy his carefully researched writings. Larry, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to be here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks for that intro, Rod. I really do appreciate it, and always happy to talk all things physical therapy.
That's right. I really enjoy your writings there. So I'd like to start on a broad note. My introduction was quite superficial relative to your many endeavors, past and present. I was hoping you could provide our audience a glimpse of your journey in the rehab world, the passion that drives you to continually innovate and do so successfully.
Thanks. I appreciate the question. I hadn't thought about this in quite a while. I think I was one of those, everybody who's been at college kind of remembers an experience where either a professor or somebody says to them, what is everybody majoring in? And look at your left, look in your right, and half you won't be here. And virtually none of you will graduate with what you think you're wanting to major in. I knew from the time I was in middle school that I wanted to become a physical therapist. I had been a student athlete. I'd been a wrestler and a football player, and had a few injuries along the way and had some exposure to sports medicine. And so that's the journey that I took. I was also an athletic trainer prior to becoming PT, at least in terms prior to going to graduate school. In my undergrad experience back in those days, that's how it was done. And I always had a little bit of an entrepreneurial flavor too. And you have to keep in mind that entrepreneurialism really didn't come about until about the mid 1980s, early to mid 1980s. But I had a little bit of that as a kid. So I was the kid with the lemonade stand, 2 paper routes, trying to find any little side hustles that I could, washing cars, working in lots and various points of the night. And I just thought, I like the side hustle. I like the innovation side of being able to create something that was purposeful at the time, at least. And so that allowed me to work my way through college very successfully. And when I got done with college, I wanted to go to PT school. And that was the days of the very early what they called entry-level master's programs. And the Army Baylor program had an excellent program. It was mostly musculoskeletal oriented, people jumping out of planes, off tanks and those kind of things. And it was the right program for me. And so as an entrepreneur in the Army, you would think that'd be a very frustrating experience, but it was quite the opposite, because in the Army, the more you want to do, the more they ask you to do. Right. So we were able to do all kinds of innovations, from on-site work injury management, acute medical clinics and the troop medical clinics. We did the early schools of back school, what it amounted to, for those that remember those kind of innovations. At the time, it was a very early EMR and documentation through a program called CHIP, which was an acronym. And if you've ever listened to any of the history of EMRs, and this was around that time when it was all evolving in the military, obviously because the money and infrastructure had the ability to do it. So we had a very early rendition of EMRs and PT. And this was again for me, about 1984, 1985 time period, and stayed in the military till 1989, had just an unbelievable experience. But My last few years in the military, started to do all kinds of PT things, started opening up clinics, started working right after I'd leave what they called moonlighting. You had to get permission to do that. Then I would change in my car and go to long-term care settings, go to freestanding centers, and really knew that's where my heart was at. And so part of the innovation side of it came out of necessity.
Yeah.
It was very expensive and difficult to rent an office space in the medical environment, which is where all healthcare was really delivered. It was really delivered in a hospital or in a attached MOB or medical office building. And I started noticing this might be a little different here. Why don't I go into one of these strip centers? And that whole world was just evolving, the whole commercial real estate world. And I said, I know we're going to get a lot of drive-by traffic, and PT is the kind of thing you don't need PT until you need it. And it's primarily a referral business then, and it's still primarily a referral business now. And so we started opening up in freestanding centers, and my goodness, it was very effective for us. So we did that in Kentucky and started to do a lot of private practice. And my first company, we ended up with about 40 to 50 locations in a couple different states, then took in some private equity money and rolled that up and ended up with well over 100 facilities. I had a different view of the industry. I was really concerned that our best and brightest weren't going into physical therapy. So I said we needed to disrupt higher education. At that time, PT had migrated from a bachelor's to a master's to a doctorate. And it made no sense to me that this sort of academic creep is what it's referred to, only benefited the academic institutions, not the profession. The master's was driven by APTA in our profession. The doctorate wasn't. It was driven by academia. And so it really concerned me that the best and the brightest. So with some colleagues, we iterated on a 2-year DPT program that was blended and hybrid. And this was pre-COVID. Our first program is almost 11 years old. Mm-hmm. And we said, instead of 3 years, we're going to do it in 2. Instead of 50 students, we're going to have 100. Instead of doing it in brick and mortar, we're going to do it through a combination of what was then called flipped education. Mm-hmm. And so they would go to campus for about 9 days every 6 weeks. And we graduated our first program after knocking on literally 100 doors, trying to find a school that would accept this business model. And we found a sleepy little university in the South called South College. And it was entrepreneurial, family-owned business, and since then we've done multiple programs outside of that. We had another company that did on-site innovations in work injury management. There's a little known in the OSHA playbook. There's a little known definition of musculoskeletal first aid, which allows a company from a regulatory standpoint to do some musculoskeletal stuff. Yep. We decided we'd take that definition and put PTs and OTs on sites. And that company now has over 1,900 places where PTs, OTs, athletic trainers, and others, ergonomists and stuff work in that environment. And then the third leg of the stool really was around network management. Can we partner and collaborate with PT clinics that we didn't own? We started doing a lot of M&A and started doing a lot of partnerships. What I call really the first and maybe still only what I would call a physical therapy partnership organization, and more private owners than any other practice in America, with literally over 100 PTs that own a piece of the rock. And that was our model. And it's been very, very successful model. We also had a company that did hospital joint ventures and on-site outsourced with hospitals. And so the innovation came as necessity as opposed to incubating. Yep. And everything from the different, we were very early adopters of EMR, for example. Now we've been very early adopters of artificial intelligence and machine learning in particular, and blended remote therapy, which I hope we get the chance to talk about. And along the way, I've migrated from CEO for over 30 plus years in 2 organizations to a founder role, and then a board role in a relationship there. And because of my relationship in the industry for so many years, I've gotten to know a lot of private equity firms. So I got involved with a couple of projects with them. And right now I went from being a board member to executive chairman to kind of an interim CEO role. Very large DSO, one of the largest in the United States. It's been an incredible experience for me in rebuilding a team and putting into place a lot of things that we do in the PT industry. I was at a meeting last night and we started counting. There's about 6 PTs that are actually CEOs of DSOs.
That's
the dental world's about 3 times. Yeah, it was like dental world's about 3 times the size of the PT world in terms of revenue. Yeah. I mean, there's 150 to 200 DSOs in the United States, and most of them private equity backed. And so it's been a fascinating transition for me. I still pay a lot of attention to the PT world. Will always do. That's where my heart is. And That's where my passion is. And it's really built on trying to make meaningful, purposeful work that impacts lives. And we were very successful at it and will continue to be. And really believe that the PT has evolved from a very prescriptive service to a very proactive, direct access, all things musculoskeletal, accessing the PT rather than we were part of research. We had research innovation with John Childs, Tim Flynn, and Rob Weiner, where they were showing very early on that the diagnostic skills of PTs and the treatment of back pain was way more beneficial and efficacious for PTs rather than everybody from orthopedists to chiropractors. You really tried to be a staunch supporter of the data and the research. And our group, our evidence in motion group in particular, has just been a who's who of academics that have really transformed it. I think the one innovation that I take some sense of pride in, because it was always people who you either academic or you're in private practice, and there was never a belief that you could merge the two. And I always felt it was more important in private practice to have an academic influence because that's where the early adopters came to. That's where the early evidence came.
Yeah.
And so we believed thoroughly in evidence-based education and really getting PTs up to speed as fast as you could. And that influence of academia and private practice is something that we started innovating really in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And it's been a key changer for our company.
Okay. Fascinating.
Long-winded answer.
I'm generally quite nascent to physical therapy, about 5 years right now with Band Connect. Certainly learning every day. I think you connected a few of the pieces for me. So, and I quite didn't understand or appreciate the role that you had in many of the aspects you just mentioned. Tremendous. I also think that you're quite prescriptive in what you do. I noticed in researching some of your timeline and academics, you went and got an MBA for yourself. Probably after you already had some PE engagement, which is fascinating in itself. You had no reason to go back there, but you did.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was in a conversation the other day with some MBA students about this various thing. Now, this is during the days where a lot of MBA students went right from undergraduate to business school. I had an incredibly successful 15, 20-year run in business before I went back and got my MBA.
Right.
And I was looking for an MBA program that was not an executive MBA. It was a traditional, but in an executive format. It took me a few years, but I found a program that fit well. And I don't know that if I'd gone to MBA school right quickly before I started my entrepreneurial journey, whether I would have had as much success, because I would have been probably way more risk averse.
Right.
And so there's something to be said that not all learning can come from a book, and that you have to fail fast, as they say, break things and figure out a way and become resilient around
Right.
it. Having said that, the MBA shaped a lot of my thinking strategically. It shaped a lot of my thinking financially, certainly as it came to building leadership teams and integrating business research and evidence into an entrepreneurial company, which is always a little healthy tension there. So yeah, it was a great experience. And after that, I even went on, I went back to the University of Pennsylvania, got a master's in applied positive psychology,
Right.
which I felt was critical because I felt that it was important for PTs to understand non-clinical factors of clinical success, empathy, compassion, listening, high quality connections. A lot of things now people are doing remote or through a blended hybrid approach. And the reality is there's a lot of evidence that suggests you can still develop a high quality connection, but you have to have intention around that. Did a long-term research project around teaching PTs these kinds of non-clinical factors and how they influence successful clinical outcomes. And so we used the photo database and had some academics work with us and really teaching PTs about burnout, the early signs of burnout, and how they can better become soft skills that they're now called. I call them the new smart skills.
Yeah.
But that was a really important epiphany for me along the way. And I'd learned that in the military. I was always fascinating. Certain patients would come in and you could say a few things. Back then we could get x-rays and say, your x-ray looks great. Okay, great. I'm fine. Wow. And there were other patients that would come in with malingering and all kinds of signs and symptoms and trying to understand that kind of psychosocial element. And back then we didn't believe pain came from the brain. We believed it was a very peripheral response. And now we know the central nervous system impact around all of this and how we can teach patients about pain. And we've had an enormous amount of fun with that. One of the fun projects that we did was modeled after that got real popular in the early 2000s was teaching high schoolers about the ill effects of drunk driving by staging funerals and staging these events at their school. They're very emotional, very impactful. And that's had a profound impact and it's moved the needle on DUI. At the same time, we've tried to use that model to teach elementary and middle school kids about chronic
Yeah.
pain and disconnecting a drug or a pill, and that you can through movement and through understanding motion is lotion and understanding how pain manifests itself and what to do about it. And so that's some work that I know we're all real proud of as well. So some fun stuff.
Oh, it sounds like every avenue you had, you dug deep into. My own experience has a combination of several startups, but those startups had exits into larger companies. And that's really where I
Mm,
learned a lot about formal process and many of the dimensions that you talked about and had the opportunity to apply it back to startups, right? So it's a
yep.
sort of a closed loop sort of an equation there. But I don't think I went to
Yeah.
the level that you did in terms of digging as deep as you did. So it's fascinating. Referring back to your early days, what was the prevailing rehab philosophy and how has it shifted since, if you see there's a change there?
It's a good question. The early days of my physical therapy experience were more of what I would call prescriptive. Physical therapy was thought of as reconstruction aids from World War II, and every patient had to be accommodated by a prescription of what to do. And then what changed was what I call the neck up skills. We started to really say, look, PTs are very smart folks. They have good critical thinking skills. They have good evaluative skills. They have good hands. They have good techniques. And the interventions around manual therapy and research started to drive a lot of our higher order skill sets. And that's been one of the things that's been fundamental. Even now, we have let reimbursement drive practice as a precursor rather than let research drive practice. Now, eventually research catches up. And in the early days, if you looked at the CPT schedules, the things that were paid, hot packs, ultrasound, electric stim,
Hmm.
okay, now those are paid marginally, if at
Yeah,
all, and it's been replaced by therapeutic
right.
interventions. And it's been replaced by manual therapy and neuromuscular therapy, higher order skills that, as it turns out, the research has found that backs up therapeutic applications for efficacy. The good news is it's also very cost effective. You can buy a whole lot of physical therapy even today for the cost of MRI. But I still worry about reimbursement driving practice. And one of the topics I know you guys are real passionate about is remote therapeutic
Yeah,
applications and hybrid applications. And it bothers me to a great extent that in some cases, I believe that the research will really support the model, but PTs are being limited right now, not through the technical kind of technology applications. Those are relatively straightforward, but by the limitations of Medicare and others that have not enabled better reimbursement. Yesterday, I participated in a board meeting for about 45 minutes. Within the board meeting, we did a remote meeting with other people around the country where we discussed a very advanced topic. And it certainly made a whole lot more sense than to fly those folks in for that 45
yeah,
minutes. And it was a very effective meeting. Well, in physical therapy, you can have very effective interventions for a patient as an adjunct of doing remote monitoring, of doing hybrid coaching,
yeah,
of doing
yeah,
Q&A, of doing facilitation. And yet we aren't adopting that in due course. Now, part of that is because of shortages. Part of it is because of PTs haven't really been taught that level of clinical intervention
yeah,
or the use of technology as an adjunct. It's either been bifurcated,
right.
all remote telehealth
Yeah,
or none.
yeah,
And we have to be more measured in that approach. And we have to forget about the reimbursement side of it for a minute because there are components of it that do get paid.
yeah,
And we have to marry that up. And yes, you got to be accountable and you got to be productive and you have to have margin, no
yeah,
mission. Look, I get it. I'm
yeah,
a businessy guy, right? Like, I get it. But at the same time, we have to assimilate. We have to think about the patient's experience and we have to really understand the engagement side of it, that you can engage with a patient very effectively, not as a replacement, but as a supplement and as an adjunctive way to get better outcomes. And the beauty is over the long run, that's how things will be adopted. We live in a world that is hybrid by design.
Yeah.
Work environments. There's a professor at Stanford doing an incredible, by the name of Bloom, that's doing an incredible amount of work on what makes a hybrid versus a remote versus everybody being on site in a workforce more effective. And as it turns out, you can do blended very effectively. Education outcomes will suggest to you that blended is preferred over either remote or in class, right? Asynchronous, synchronous, instructional design. You can facilitate learning better in a blended environment. And I think it's going to become normalized over time. It just isn't yet. But these things change slowly when you have reimbursement models that for a temporary time precede reimbursement in terms of driving practice.
Yep. And you've seen several chapters of that, right? From our perspective as Band Connect, we are carrying the flag on one version of hybrid rehab. There are many definitions, right? And that sort of leverages and builds upon that in-clinic experience to drive that holistic engagement, which we believe is so critical to the overall experience, both for the clinician as well as the patient. One of the things that I often think about, and when we started Band Connect, our entire emphasis was on driving compliance and patient accountability in terms of their at-home rehab and continuing the therapy through its plan of care. And as I learn more and more about the process through our experiences, right, I often question myself, right? So is it the symptom or is it the cause? Is it perhaps the issue of patient compliance is actually a symptom of everything else that we're doing, right? I'm sure there's a part of both, but I'd love to get your thoughts, that sort of concept.
Yeah, I think it's critical that we consider when we hear in the medical frame compliance, immediate bells and whistles go off about Medicare and notes and modifiers and all those kind of things. But adherence to treatment plan is really what you're referring to in this context of compliance. And it is critical. It's not the intervention, it's the adherence. So the best example I know is diabetes. The ability to treat diabetes has jumped in years and years of success. However, it's way more dependent on the adherence of the patient. And so you, as a practitioner, you have to think of what can I do to drive better patient compliance or adherence to the treatment of diabetes that I'm going to do. There's a whole research area called hope theory, getting the patient to buy into all of those kind of things and understanding the emotional connection that you have to drive the outcome. It's not the drug. It's not that's the intervention, but it's the combination of the practitioner and the patient engagement, assimilation, and experience that's going to drive the adherence to get that patient better. We know that clearly. What we have to do as PTs is apply that same thinking to patient care in musculoskeletal, low back pain, neck pain, shoulder pain. Manual therapy is the intervention. Clear cut, the research suggests it, but that won't alone get patient adherence into better safety precautions, better ability in the biomechanics of lifting, better self-care and self-management. What will do that is the relationship, engagement, and experience of the patient and the emotional connection they drive with the therapist and the ongoing ability for them to do check-ins and the ability to facilitate a better relationship in a complete area of episodic care. I think in one thing in PT that we really conflated was in pediatric PT, they've done a really good job of saying, look, if you got a cerebral palsy kid, over the long run, you can't look at episodic care. You have to look at a long 2, 3, 4, 5-year period. And they're 100% correct and accurate on that. And so the changes that you're going to make are going to be seen, small changes, incremental changes over a long period of time. But for whatever reason in PT, we started getting in this battle of fewer visits, better outcomes, right? That the less visits, the better. And that conflating is absolutely ridiculous. And what you now have to think of, and we know the recurrence rate of low back pain is 80, 90%. We have to think of how can we take our episode of care over a 2, 3, 4, 10-year period through coaching, through remote accessing of their personal PT, in cases where you need the hands-on intervention in a clinic of manual therapy. And that's how we have to think about these things rather than acute episodes. And you know what? Who's brainwashed us into that? Insurance
Right.
companies, the payers. And again, reimbursement drives practice. We can't think about that anymore.
Yep. Yep. Because we're all keying off of number of visits allocated, et cetera. And so then you have
Exactly.
your boundaries defined. Uh, the good news is in our travels with the clinics and organizations that we're dealing with, there is some of that conversation that you're talking about right now.
Good.
They call it maintenance, but it's part of the same thing, right? The treatment or the therapy is not done just because you're done with your number of visits. There's an ongoing, maybe the cadence is reduced somewhat, but the ongoing relationship is an important element to avoid recurrence or other behavior practices that may be there. One of the things that we've been able to drive through our nascent introduction of technology is significant patient adherence, using your term here, 80% or higher. And we've yet to spend a lot of time dissecting that, right? So, what are the levers that we've introduced that are driving that behavior change? And I think some of the research that you just mentioned might be good sources for us to go back and look retrospectively at, because I think it's important for all of us to understand. It's great that we're getting great results. What are the different markers or levers that we're leveraging that is actually driving that change? So, maybe a somewhat controversial topic. People refer to PT as being within an existential crisis of sorts, right? There are times when I think that the characterization dramatizes the circumstances in a highly unproductive manner. But I'll admit I've been split because I'm looking at two ends of the spectrum, right? Because on one end, I see, and I think you alluded to this, highly trained, smart clinicians who are really passionate about their patients, spending a lot of time doing their best within the constraints that they have. We've come across so many of these, which is why we've become flag carriers for the industry as well, because we recognize these folks. But on the other hand, we also see people who are driven by the markers of reimbursement, PT productivity, number of visits, and so on and so forth, the two ends of that. I just wanted to get your perspective. You're on all sides of this.
Yeah. PT has not had fundamental changes in its business model. I'm not talking about in its terms of clinical interventions. We've had great maturation and evolvement of primarily being a prescriptive hot pack ultrasound and massage to critical thinking to interventions involving hands-on skills like manual therapy and therapeutic exercise. But the business model of PT hasn't changed much. It's been driven, what allowed PT early on was Medicare allowing, and I think 1965 that even recognized Part B payment for PT. But the model has not changed significantly. And so that's one aspect that bothers me. And today we're in a quagmire around it because we're still stuck to the same business model. And the way that manifests itself is that PTs are primarily judged now on their productivity,
Right.
their units per visit, how many new patients they've seen, and all these KPIs. Trust me, I'm a data guy. Like these are the data that I was monitoring in the late 80s. So this is not like rocket science. At the same time, we had unprecedented hiccups post-COVID. We had shortages. We had conservatively 15,000 plus PTs left the professions. We only graduate now about 11, almost 12,000 PTs. Back in the 90s, we would graduate 5,000 PTs and 5,000 foreign trained therapists would come into the USA and get licensed. And so the uptake in our profession, the demand has never been as high as it is right now. The shortages have never been as pronounced. And so the efficacy, the cost effectiveness and all that stuff has worked. And we're now a victim of that success by the business model that we remain in. And so PTs cannot think outside of the box. They can't normalize hybrid remote therapeutic monitoring and other kinds of things because they tend to have owners, what I call unprofessional management that only thinks in terms of KPIs and board decks, not on what's in the best interest of the patient. And until we can get out of that and put PTs at the tip of the spear on being able to be more inclined towards their own reimbursement models and being able to be paid for what they do rather than somebody monitoring. We monitor PTs more than we monitor patients. That's genuinely scary.
Yeah.
It ought to be, the turnaround ought to be that.
Well said.
You have to be monitoring patients a whole lot
Yeah.
more than you're monitoring your therapist, but we don't. And I hope that shift occurs, but that shift is we got to get through this period. And then the third sort of headwind we had there was really inflation. And so you had this high period of inflation, high shortages. And then on top of that, the reimbursements did not keep up lockstep with the business model. It's throughout all of healthcare. And as reimbursement in most traditional settings has stagnated, gone down, you've just gotten to a point where it's very difficult. I call it a penny nickel business because it's very difficult to create a margin. And so we over monetize the PT's ability to produce units and visits without overly concern. And because the demand is so high right now, nobody seems to really care.
Right.
And that's genuinely sad. I just mean that holistically, not.
Yeah. Yeah. I think some of what you were referring to in terms of the business model, and we were surprised when we started digging in that everybody talks about value-based care, but there was practically nothing in the PT industry. There's some elements.
There's less today. There's less value-based care today in PT than there was 3 and 5 years ago.
Seriously.
Less. Yes. Because we had a lot of Medicare innovation projects that bundled PT in total shoulders, total knee, total hips, and other aspects. We had some Medicare risk that incorporated PT. Most, if not all of that has gone away, and providers are reticent to take on any risk. I can't blame them. And so I don't even hear, I've always tried to be on the front ends of these things. You don't even hear people talking about value-based care and PT anymore.
But there are some.
It's not, it should be. We should. I'm an advocate of value-based care and being unconcerned with fee-for-service and getting patients the best interventions for the best outcome, liberating the regulations so that PTs aren't so much worried about all the documentation, the Medicare compliance and rules. But we're far from that. We're steeped in it even worse today than we were, like I said, 3 years ago.
The whole RTM CPT codes fell into our lap, right? And I always looked at it as a precursor. It's the starting point for collecting data elements that would allow and drive towards a value-based care and orientation is the way that I looked at it. But I'm actually quite disappointed about the spotty adoption across different types of organizations. And in some cases, also the wrong behavior change, if you will. Organizations chasing that additional kernel of margin or revenue, however you look at it, using any means possible without necessarily considering that broader perspective, which we just talked about earlier about engagement and so on and so forth. But I don't know if you've seen anything different from your standpoint, or if you have any ideas about the future, if you will, based on that.
I think the future is more, in terms of reform along the payer side, is more confusing than it's ever been. It lacks clarity simply because most of the payers are failing right now. You look on the Medicare Advantage market, it's over 50% of the market, but most of those companies look at their stocks and they've all been either in current or future lawsuits by the federal government on everything from upcoding to all the issues around the star ratings. The primary care value-based models, with some exception, largely failed because they overpaid, whether it be Amazon, CVS, all those things we read about. It all started in primary care, and they've largely failed. There is always some exceptions for sure, but I just don't see. What I don't see is value-based care hitting the PT market anytime really soon. However, what I do see, I am hopeful about, is alternative payment models in PT, and they're not the same. Value-based would be taking on things as a total risk and allocating it across the continuum or across the specialties. Alternative payment models might say to the PT practice, this low back is worth $1,000, or we're going to pay you on a per diem basis rather than a fee for service. So I do think you'll see some changes there, particularly in areas where you have high density of a certain payer. So if a Blue Cross, for example, is real big in certain areas, or you might have a nonprofit that has a certain number of lives in the Medicare, Medicaid risk world, you might see some PT play in those alternative payment models. I just don't think providers are willing to accept a lot of risk right now. around holdbacks and the traditional models of value-based pay. But I do believe alternative payment, it's an absolute.
Yep.
We've already got plenty of money in the system. We can't keep putting more money in the healthcare system and expect anything different. That's insanity. But so we have to create some alternatives to it. And I think the payment models are the easiest places to start.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Another hot topic for the day today, switching topics a little bit. So we're all seen and heard about the Hinge IPO that certainly went through, and we're seeing some other examples similar in that range. Congratulations to them. That was a huge achievement in themselves. But I certainly don't agree with the premise that AI-based care can automate 95% of clinician oversight or care. And so I don't know if that sentence was purely for Wall Street or whether they actually believe in that. I have a hard time believing that. But anyways, I hope in mind, the good news with that statement and their positioning is that it catalyzes all the different things that you're doing. It catalyzes attention and reaction from the broader PT industry because they've largely been out of the loop in terms of many of these things happening out there, and that has gotten a lot of press. I know some of your viewpoints, having read some of your points of view. Just for our listeners over here, if you could share a little bit.
Yeah, so there's a bunch. The digital health market in general has reached its peak some years back now, and the valuations are generally way, way down. Many of these companies are no longer in business. They were venture capital started, and their down rounds didn't continue. Hinge, Sword, Viore. I mean, there are some exceptions.
Yep.
Armada is the other one I'm thinking of. But in any event, I even looked like the last round with Sword, which was just announced the other day, was 14 billion down to whatever it was, 4 billion. Yeah. I think I'm directionally correct there. But back to Hinge, and their S1 was very truthful. They called it exercise therapy. I give them a lot of credit. They're like what I said about Houdini. He was a horrible magician, but he created another category called escape. And so what Hinge did is they created this category called exercise therapy. Now they've released stuff that says they're going to create a PPO network around PT, which I think is a disaster. Not many practices, when you have the demand we have, are going to accept a 50% reduction and join anything they're part of. I think part of their fundamental data is not long-term going to be successful. And I'll give you an example of it. I've met with, as a CEO of companies that are self-insured, your TPAs are always introducing point of service solutions to help you reduce cost of it, whether it be in mental health, behavioral health, and now it's in musculoskeletal is a big one. And really what all hinges is a point of service solution. And so part of what they measure the effect is, has it reduced the number of patients that have gone to a PT clinic and saved you money? That's fundamentally flawed. You want more patients going to PT clinics so that you can get resolution of the problem rather than get drugs, imaging, surgery, and see specialists. Right. And so I think their data point, at least that has been presented to me, is very old school thinking. It's an avoidance strategy, not an embracing strategy. Yeah. And so I think they're going to have to change their business model. And I think they're going to have problems in the public market. That's my opinion. Yep. I don't know that for a fact. They were in the PT world for a while and did a pretty quick pivot out of it at some point. Yeah. Sword was way more leaning towards on the PT end, and still is, but has pivoted a little bit away from it. Now you're seeing the companies go after behavioral health. You're seeing them go after other aspects of weight loss, chronic pain. You saw where Weight Watchers emerged from bankruptcy. And it's a short story there. They were a Louisville-based company founded in Louisville many years ago. So they've had 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 generations of doing well, going bankrupt, somebody else buying them. And now they're going after the menopause industry. These things are always manifested by pivots. I'm glad to see IPOs though. I think and I do have great respect for their company and what they've done. And indirectly, it's helped PT because what they've done to the market is said, we're doing exercise therapy is doing physical therapy. Right. They don't say that in their S1, but their customers say that. Right. Their customers, which are the insurance companies. So I'm not of the belief that point of solution impacts the TPAs do. This is not a new phenomenon. They've been doing point of service stuff for many years. PBM started out as a point of solution, and You saw what they do. It's just changed under the big, beautiful bill with PBMs and other states hawking back on rebates. But so because I don't believe their fundamental approach to musculoskeletal is
Yeah.
sound. On that level, I don't think they're going to be successful. Now, if they pivot into something and they have an incredible amount of success, God bless
Yeah.
them. No issue at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I see the storyline changing over time, and I think there's plenty to go around. So we welcome innovation changes.
Okay.
And
Speaking of which, and that's the one thing I'll say, like I'll get calls from, and I'll talk to some of my colleagues in the PT world. They'll say, man, there's a lot of companies doing remote or hybrid. And I said, not enough of
yeah,
them. We need to welcome all of them that bring in that sense of innovation to it. Because if you look in the white space is enormous. We are only capturing 10 to 12% of the musculoskeletal sector in PT.
right.
If using technology enables us to see more than 10 to 12%, and that's good. And I believe the efficacy of treatment of using check-ins and coaching and facilitation in a blended environment is going to be very effective. The combination of those two things, I would argue we don't have enough companies in the market.
Yeah. So I'll just try to close out then with some rapid questions, fun questions, if you
Sure.
a trend in rehab that excites you. I think we've talked about it, but I'd love to hear it in a sort of.
I am excited by AI generally, and I divide it between AI on the clinical side of things versus the processing business side of things. So we are iterating on AI and everything from talent management and acquisition to education and training to revenue cycle management, pre-authorization, posting of payments, certainly uses of it to be a scribe and capturing
Yeah.
the point of care. I believe that'll eliminate a lot of friction points. I think the future will be digitalizing the entire encounter and producing a properly note that would be acceptable to the payers from that. Very optimistic on it. So that excites me quite a bit. I do believe that I continue to get really excited about that the demand for PT is so high right now, and that will drive innovation for us to figure out care models that work in a very creative, innovative
Yeah.
way through the use of extenders and allowing PTs to maximize their neck up skills and their hands-on skills to become more managers of care, as opposed to just one-to-one type of care that has been.
Agree with you.
And to extend our ability, not restrict
Yeah.
it. We're one of the few, if you really look at it, I think I wrote an article about this, maybe referenced it more than once. We are one of the few professions whose productivity has decreased in the last 5 years. Name me many other professions. Normally technology enhances your ability to PTs, because of Medicare rules restriction, not just Medicare, but others, the regulatory environment has decreased our ability to be productive. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's crazy to hear. So a trend that worries you, continuing with questions.
Yeah, the trend that worries me the most is I think private equity backed PT space in particular, you're gutting founders and entrepreneurs out of it and trying to replace it with professional managers who are ruining the business, and they're ruining they're over leveraged and are hurting it. It's not just in PT. You see the same thing in veterinary. You see the same thing in dental. That's why the business model needs to change. The correlation, and I wrote a couple articles on this, but the correlation between local ownership and entrepreneurs running their own shop. And I always tried to tell my management folks, we want to be the first company where common sense is common practice. Everybody knows it. The data supports it. And yet day in, day out, unprofessional management tries to drive PT founders out. And those who are the most passionate about the business model. That's a trend that drives me nuts.
And I know this is close to your heart. What's the one piece of advice that you would give clinicians, patients, or students who want to get into this field?
Yeah, it goes back. First of all, I'm very encouraged by younger PTs. I know there's a lot, once you get old, become an old fogey, there's a certain sense of, I see incredible skills. I have concerns, particularly on the communication side and the overuse of technology and all the things you read about. But I'm very excited about the critical thinking skills and the openness of young therapists. And so that excites me quite a bit. And people who go into the profession, not thinking they're doing it for the right reasons rather than it's going to be the entree to wealth, excites me because they're doing it for the right reasons to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. The one piece of advice I would give them is nothing original for me, but the more you can help others get what they want, the more you will get what you want. And the reality is that the best way to get ahead is through service to others. That ends up being one of the most selfish things you can do, because all it does is help to your benefit from. Yeah. The other piece of advice is that you have to be respectful of the profession in terms of the patience and time that it takes to master your craft. Yeah. PTs have incredible skill sets, but they have to start out as clinicians. The better clinician you become, the better business person you'll become, because the transportable skill sets are absolutely go across those lines. They have to honor that craft and have good education and training and mentorship along the way, because the world of PT is going to continue to evolve and be much different today than it was when. You got to understand, when I was in the PT, when I started out as a PT, we put ACL injuries in casts for 4 months. Think of that today. You mentioned, you got to get an ACL surgery and you're going to be a cast from your hip to your toes for 16 weeks.
Wow.
It's absurd. And so that's how much has changed. In my view, we're going to have that same amount of change over the next 25 years.
I love your optimistic outlook all through this conversation. In closing, I referenced your Substack segment, All Things Physical Therapy, earlier. Anything else that you want to share with our listeners and the audience here about how they can follow you?
No, I just enjoy being part of the conversation and exchanging ideas and being very curious about the future. Those who read, I've had a pretty good audience around my Substack. Certainly, I've had really good people who've read my book, Called to Care, and continue to reach out and have good dialogues. I was with a bunch of young PTs yesterday that have a really innovative business in the PT world. And it's just great to hang around with them and exchange ideas and try to figure out what will work.
Excellent. Thank you, Larry. Engaging in this discussion. I know I could have gone on for another hour, maybe.
Anytime. We'll do it again.
Thank you for all your flag carrying work for your industry segment. As an outsider, I see it. I hope others within your segment appreciate it as well. We certainly do. You've been listening to Rehab Remix, Reimagining Boundaries, produced by Band Connect. I'm Rohit Nayak, inviting you to join us next time as we continue this journey together. Thank you, Larry.